Hello, St. Matthew's United Methodist Church, and those of you who are joining us online. I'm Pastor Kelly.
And I'm Pastor Dave.
I'm so glad you're here to join us as we slog through the Ten Commandments. I'm just kidding. It's a joke. This is second to final week of our summer series, right?
No, I think I've got 3 more.
It's like you ask a pastor, like, how much longer? And pastor's like, when I'm done.
All the way through August.
All the way through. No, we've been working through Exodus, and this week, I love that you brought Letterman into the sermon this week. I was like, what's a David Letterman? There's gonna be a lot of that, by the way, today where I'm ribbing Dave. We were talking a little bit on the way over here about, pop culture. It's like, what's a Charlton Heston? Like who is that? So Exodus 20 verses 1 through 17. And this is what part of the story, Dave? Oh yeah. The Holy Spirit's here too. Yay.
What part of the story? So, Exodus begins, of course, with Moses and God calling him into action. Moses and God, they have their burning bush moment together. Moses goes to Egypt, acquires the release of the Israelites. They've walked through the desert, walked through the Red Sea. They've been fed. They've been given drink, from the water on the rock.
They've been attacked.
They've been attacked. God has taken care of them and led them and loved on them throughout this time. And we come now to the time of the Ten Commandments.
The Ten Commandments.
The giving of the law. So it's actually more than just the 10. There's more law than just fits on the tablets.
Oh, I just put Billy Mays Hayes' head on you. But wait, there's more.
Yeah, there's more, but wait. But wait.
We're going to dispel every theological argument and difference. I'm just kidding. We don't have enough time for that today. But I am excited, though, to talk about the Ten Commandments. And growing up like a good Catholic kid, learned a lot about the Ten Commandments, and very specifically a couple of them. And then as I got older, I was like, that's not what that says at all. But anyway, yeah. So we've been working through Exodus. We've come to the point where the Israelite people wait. Moses goes to meet with God and then is given the commandments, right?
Well, this actual passage, they're being spoken.
That's right.
So it's not till quite a few chapters later where the tablets actually get put on stone. So this is the verbal kind of giving of the commandments, if we want to call them commandments. And so there's a lot of detail. If you actually read through, you said it was 17 verses. So there's several pretty good sized paragraphs talking about kind of the thought behind several of the commandments anyway. But calling them commandments can give us kind of one view on what they are, can lead us in a way just by naming them that. But I think it's important to note that different traditions call them different things. 10 Commandments is kind of our culture and our tradition and our kind of time. But Jewish people call them the 10 words or the 10 utterances, the 10 sayings, because they kind of list them differently than we do. And to
the people that they were actually given to.
Yeah. Well, of course, we don't have a picture of what the tablets actually look like.
Can you imagine?
We just have this description.
Yeah,
we just have the description. So how you're going to number them is there's some amount of interpretation that has to happen, even in kind of numbering the words or the commandments.
Right.
And in the Jewish kind of numbering, the very first word is, I am the Lord your God. I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. I'm the one who brought you out of slavery. Not a commandment.
It's like a statement.
And so that's why they call them the words or utterances, because they're not all kind of commands.
Right.
Here's just a phrase put in there. And if you think about that phrase, it leads you into the rest of the list, because it says, this is predicated on you belonging to God and God belonging to you.
Right.
If you accept God, if you worship God, if you want to grow in your knowledge of God, then these commandments are for you. is kind of where that leads. And if not, then I don't know what kind of bearing they have. You know.
Well, and I love that you said that. It's like, so if I'm hearing you right, then, just numbering them 1 through 10 and slapping them like a poster on the wall probably isn't super effective for their intent and purpose.
Well, well, asking what their intent is, I think, kind of leads us into how we are to understand what is their intent. I mean, their intent is to help create a community based on the love of God. The commandments, especially the second table, the last 6, really point to loving your neighbor and how to do that.
Right.
And a community that knows what it means to love your neighbor, then is very, I think, attractive to the communities that surround this faithful one, and gives an opportunity to then learn who God is for those who are outside of the fold.
Right.
Currently.
Right. Yeah, and I think contextually as well, something else that's happening here is this is a people group currently, right, that have been under, a foreign ruler. They have not had to, quote unquote, self-govern or govern themselves or come up with these systems or these things or think through this stuff or answer these questions, because a lot of those things had been done for them or to them. Right. And so I also I'm pointing to this because I think it's a really important contrast. Is it's not just like the timeless questions that these utterances, right, answer, especially when we start to ask the question of like, why were they given or what's their intent? But it's even the context in which and who and when they're given and when they're communicated, right? So like when I think about like what they had been exposed to and what the Israelite people were living through, and then to be given these and be like, this is my heart for people and for us together as we go together forward. I'm like, this is also so different than what they were used to.
Well, it was countercultural at the time.
It's crazy.
And living in Egypt as slaves, they were bound then to that culture. But these commandments and really kind of the way we're taught to live as Christians lead us into living in a countercultural way, in a way that's very different from culture, not in that we become arrogant and wag our fingers at those who are not faithful, but that we put love at the center of who we are, and then let that become a light that shines into the nations.
Yeah.
That shows the world how you are to live, and that is by loving your neighbor, by worshiping God, by walking with God. And the kind of the way that looks from the outside is very different, but it's very attractive. And so it helps people want to become followers of God.
Right. And not to get too far off the topics that we're going to really dive into today, more at least, is I think, so when we say countercultural, right, I think that's something we should kind of flesh out or define a little bit more. And so I would say like, because I think a lot of times in spiritual places or Christian places that I've been, we define culture as like anybody who's not us. And I go, like we do the dualism thing where it's like, we good, them bad, fight. Like, and I don't want to say that. What I think is, and Egypt is a great example of this, is Egypt has sold itself into incredibly sinful practices that make God's created beings and God's creation have less worth than God intended it to have. And so the devices and the power dynamics and the systems and the structures of that culture that are in place are where slavery exists, and we're killing people and we're harming them and we're not treating them like actual people that are loved and have value and matter. And so when I'm saying it, at least when we say like countercultural, one of the reasons I'm so fascinated about when these are given and how they're given to the Israelite people is it's almost to me like it's not even just like, okay, what do we go do with these? It's like, wait, this is who I am. Like I'm viewed this way. Like me and everybody else, we're all viewed this way because where they come from, that is completely not the case. You don't have worth and value unless you produce something and or like somebody says you do. This is like a really important moment. You know, I think in human history, if you will, of like how God is going, no, this is what I'm saying. This is what this means. And it's not just for you. This is for everybody. Everybody is matters and has value. And like, and this is the way that we do life together. This is the way that this works. And I think that, you know, if you're watching this or listening to this and you're used to a culture or systems or things in place that devalue and dehumanize and take things away, this is like a really cool thing that where God comes and goes, no, it's the opposite of that. I'm giving you it all, and I want to be with you, and this is how we love. You love me, I love you, and that's how we love each other together, and we do this thing together, and that doesn't exist. That's not Egypt. That's not any of the major powers or major players of the day. And I think, like you're saying, like that's not. It's part of what makes a community of people so attractive to somebody else. But when we live this way, that's kind of like our purpose. And like we it's not that we unlock something, but it's like you fulfill that purpose in you that you're like, oh, like I'm loved and other people are too. Like, this is good. This is really good. And then other people can see that in other communities and other places. And then the other place, and we won't get too far, and we won't get into this today, but the other place you'll see these concepts and these things brush against is what happens when God has called us to live this way and other places are not. And like that then there's problems and there's conflict, and it's like, oh, what do we do with this? Right. So anyway, I love that imagery of like, you've known no other way to live except that. And then God comes and goes, no, here. You're like, what?
It's the whole light on the hill from Sermon on the Mount.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So screw my notes. Like these are not in my notes. You can tell like I really did a good job prepping this week. No. So you tied this to the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
This week. Talk about that.
Well, there's so if you look at the Ten Commandments as a way of forming a community that for the chosen people that then illuminates to the world the character of God. I see Jesus talking about that very same topic in the Sermon on the Mount. You know, the Sermon on the Mount starts with the Beatitudes, which is shining light on those who are normally in the shadows, lifting them up, so to speak. Then the very next kind of paragraph or section in the Sermon on the Mount is the light on the hill passage. You know, be the light on the hill. Don't don't hide it under a basket.
Yeah.
You know, all of that. And all those kids songs, pop into my head all of a sudden. But he's talking about creating a community that is an example to the world of how God has created us to live.
Right.
And then he goes through, and then the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus taking the law and traditions and customs and practices and saying how they had been perverted or kind of corrupted or gotten wrong. I mean, and so he talks about some commandments and the way that they've been misused. You know, if for example, he says, if you're angry with a brother, you've broken a commandment.
Right.
And you say, well, I don't remember anger being in the 10 words. But Jesus says, if you're angry with your brother or sister, you are guilty of murder. You've broken that commandment. If you're listening to the intent of the commandments, if you're not trying to find the loopholes so that you can get around.
Right.
And so Jesus calls them out on trying to work those loopholes. The eye for an eye thing. It's all. He talks about prayer. He talks about fasting. He's talked about how we've gotten all of these kind of things twisted, corrupted, how we practice them wrong, and then the Sermon on the Mount corrects them, and serves as a beacon of how you are to live, so that you become the light on the hill.
Right.
And so I see just a lot of similarities. I would much rather, and in my ministry, when somebody's asking me, well, how do I live, or what does it mean to live, I'll point to the Sermon on the Mount before I point to the Ten Commandments anytime. I think it is the work of Jesus calling us back from kind of getting it wrong, you know, being lost in some ways, and then putting us on the kind of the right track. And he does it, you know, by lifting up the broken, by talking about being the light on the hill, and then about kind of saying, this is the way you've misunderstood tradition, law, practices, those kind of things that are wrapped around the faith.
Yeah.
And I find a lot of the correctives that he makes were true not only in the first century, but have a lot of resonance today.
Stop pointing at me, Dave. Well, and I think too. So like you know, this is just my own personal take. You know, put on your proverbial Pastor Kelly hat. This is one of the reasons why, like with Scripture, very often, if not always, I think it can be really problematic or dangerous, if you will, to take things literally at face value how I interpret them. Right? Because even what we're talking about, right? Like what Jesus is doing is not changing or altering the commandments or the sayings or the utterances, right? Jesus is recoloring the context of the time and when and why and what purpose they were meant to fulfill, right? Like that's what Jesus is doing. Jesus isn't like, oh, like...
I don't think he's revealing something new. I think that was the purpose.
That's
all
the
along,
point. And
all
so
along,
it's so people's interpretations throughout the years, or the systems and the things and the culture, and the ways that people had bought into things that were not of God, or not with being with God and with each other, and the ways that God intended us to be. Jesus is kind of calling those. I think Jesus is calling attention to those things and going, listen, like this is not what this means. This is what this means. You don't do this. And what's so fascinating to me, right? Like, and not to get too far into the Gospels here, right? But it's often, right, when Jesus is correcting or rebuking, it's like, I'm always like, oh, you're talking to somebody who is just self-interested. Like me. Like, this is about me. This is how do I get what I need? How do I like do the right thing? How do I distance myself from, it's about me. And then like Jesus is like, no, it's about us. and I'm like, oh, so the 10 Commandments or the 10 utterances in the Sermon on the Mount are not about personal survival. They're about how do we love each other well? How do we do life together? And I'm like, oh no. that's the backdrop where I think you're kind of pointing to, is like if you come at them from that perspective, and then like, you know, 2023 America go, oh no. Oh no. And not that we're unredeemable and there isn't some wonderful, great things happening stateside too. Like that's not what I'm getting at, but that conviction there, right? Of like, okay, so like have we turned these things into self-serving purposes, exclusionary purposes? That's another big one, I think, too, of like, you know, oftentimes like misinterpretations I see with the Israelite people or the Jewish people is, well, they were the chosen people and everybody else could just go die. And I go, no, Christians aren't chosen people and everybody else can just go die because we're doing it right. It's they were given this responsibility to then go share it with everyone else and correct it, not make people do, like, you know what I mean? Like it's not the Spanish Inquisition where we make you convert. It's that they would do life and do community and have a relationship with God in such a way that when people would come in contact with that, they would want it too.
Exactly. Well, you're seeing kind of creation fulfilled. You know, when it's done that way. You're seeing the kind of the perfect example of peace being lived out. And that's the part that pulls people in, because anybody who's living in a world where peace is absence, I mean, they want that more than anything. And to look around and not see an example of it is one thing, but when you can see the light shining, you know, over there, that's what peace looks like. That's what wholeness looks like.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we were created to live. And maybe you can't say it in those words, but that's the desire that is built within us that we are created with.
Right. Well, and I, again, back to the, I'm thinking contextually, right? Like, Jesus leaves the city to go to the hills and go to the outskirts and go to where all the like rejects are to share this with them. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about a nomadic people who have been like dehomed. What's the term, right? Like they've been, they're displaced. Mm-hmm. They do not have a place to call their own. Like, and right, wasn't the chapter we did last week? Weren't people trying to kill them?
The Amalekites.
Yeah. So like there's, and God's been with them, but it's, when we say God's with them, it's also like in the context of like everything's trying to kill them too. Like it's not been smooth sailing, right? It's been hard.
It's been wilderness.
It's been wilderness. Good word. And so
where could we find that?
Oh look, there's some dirt, there's some wilderness. Oh look, there's some wilderness there too. There's wilderness everywhere. But but for me, when I think about like these concepts and this intention and the truth of what is being shared with them when the commandments or the phrases or the utterances are shared. And then also in the Sermon on the Mount is people who have not lived that way, or all that we know or have known is something that is completely opposite of that. That sounds a lot like freedom. Mm-hmm. And then once you start living into that, like this is one of the reasons I think like if the Israelite people and the Jewish people become such a powerhouse, it's because when they're doing this, like at times, and then they don't do this and it goes terribly. But if you come in contact with a group of people who are like doing this, you're like, I want in. I want to be a part of that. And then the other thing that I love is, and this isn't in the Sermon on the Mount, but part of what we do when we do these things in this community and we love God well and we're loved well and we love others well is we're also trying to make sure that people come to the table and we make a place. Mm-hmm. Right. So doing this community is also not just about like the light on the hill. Like I know what you mean by it, but sometimes I think when people might hear that, they go, okay, where's the hill and where's the light and how do I get there? And I go, well, part of my responsibility is to like go to you with that light and to make a space for another person and find ways to connect with them, to bring them into whatever we're doing. And I didn't say manipulate. I didn't say proselytize. I didn't say like, ultimatum it. I didn't say like
there's no shame involved.
No, and you don't, and it's not nefarious. Mm-hmm. And I'd argue like, man, where are we at? Hold on. Yeah, this is another podcast for another day. But like even when we talk about evangelism, some people think evangelism is like a dirty word. Like doing this is what we call evangelism. This is like this is what it means to like live like the people of God, and people will come and be a part. Like that's what God says to do. And it's like, oh, so if we love people well and we live this way,
maybe we're starting to learn a little about the gospel. Then.
Maybe I'm learning a little bit about the gospel. But right. And so I love that you tied those two together, because oftentimes, at least for me, is like I'd read something in the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament. I read this and I go, what do I do with that? It's not written to me. I mean, it's written like it's things that I can get something from. And then like I love that you propose the question of like, well, why? What's the context here? Mm-hmm. Like what's happening? Mm-hmm. And then where's a correlation with, like Jesus? And it's like, oh, these are very similar.
Well, I mean, it's not that there's two random occurrences that are similar. It's the message that has always been there. That is just has to be retold sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think that's my closing thought here, at least, will be like, this is one of the reasons I'm so thankful for grace, is that even when I change or I miss it or my perspective is off, God is still trying to go, Kelly, look, like I'm like, come on, like this is what this looks like. And I go, oh yeah, that's right. I remember that now. Like, let's do that. Like that makes sense to me. And, we're talking about thousands of years difference between this moment and the scriptures and Jesus. And we're talking about thousands of years of Jesus into now. And yet, be loved by God, love God back, love ourselves, and love everybody else to the best of our ability with what we have, and be good to each other has never changed. It's always constant.
Yeah.
Cool. What about you?
What about me?
Closing thought?
The closing thought.
Closing argument, sir. Approach the bench.
Closing argument. Wow, there's
many.
There's so much to be said about the commandments. I just believe with all my heart that practicing our faith is all about finding the peace that we were made to enjoy. And when we look at elements of the law or scripture in any way and make them about something else, we've missed the point. But when we don't miss the point, I mean, the benefits and the repercussions of that are amazing, in that it brings wholeness, it brings healing, it builds communities that are whole. It builds people that then can flourish in the way that God intended. So, the repercussions of this are just huge. Really, both in the positive and in the negative kind of aspects of that. But when we get it right, as best that we can, man, that's the world I want to live in.
That's awesome. Pastor Kelly.
And I'm Pastor Dave.
And we'll see you next week.